Okay, again, if you never met her before, that's Carol, our music chair, right? It says that in the program. That's why I found out. Now we'd like to introduce our special guest, Rabbi Sternfield.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. That song sounded vaguely familiar. I've heard it someplace before. I really like this lectern, by the way. You know, it offers great protection to the person up here. When you start throwing rotten vegetables at me, I'll be able to duck very effectively. So, excellent. Well, as I begin my remarks this morning, I do want to take a few moments to express personal appreciation to the members of the Unitarian Universalist movement as a whole. Over the years, progressive Jews and Unitarians have found a lot of common ground. We are, after all, two liberal religious communities who are unfortunately swimming against the tide of religious fundamentalism. Both see ourselves as fulfilling the role of being of service to the entire community of which we are a part. You may or may not know this, but in earlier days, when some Jews in this country found, due to anti-Semitism, that it was too difficult or challenging in the workplace or society to identify as Jews, they found a hospitable and comfortable home in the Unitarian Church. In fact, some Unitarian communities had so many former Jews that they were referred to informally as Junitarian churches. I am actually happy that that is no longer the situation. Not that I wish for you decreased members, but simply that the vast majority of American Jewish people no longer feel stigmatized by our own identity, and I would say that is a good thing for us and a good thing for America. And for that matter, people of all faiths and cultural backgrounds should feel safe with their own identity without need for equivocation or disguising their heritage or hiding in shame for the acts of others. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Jews and Unitarians always see eye to eye. This has become more apparent as our respective communities continue to struggle with the seemingly irresolvable conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I wouldn't be speaking frankly with you today if I did not allude to the fairly recent decision of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, to divest from several companies that do business in the Israeli-occupied territories. This is known as the BDS movement. You may be familiar with it, standing for Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions. And it has taken its cue from the successful anti-apartheid movement, which transformed South Africa quite a few years ago. I've not come here to criticize or oppose or endorse that position. I do understand where it's coming from, some of which is true to your own ideals and values, and others, I'm sorry to say, have come from some who have somewhat less noble sentiments. But these resolutions are not so easily dismissed, since they appear to strike at the heart of matters that are extremely important to my Jewish people, namely the very existence and security of the State of Israel. But I do want to point out that there are even some Jewish organizations that are sympathetic to BDS, and many individual Jewish students on college campuses that also support it in their own way. What we should all be able to agree upon, I hope we do, is that this conflict has gone on for far too long, and that it has been the source of way too much pain and tragedy, all the more so because it is under the context or pretext of being a religious conflict. This leads me, therefore, to the central question of my remarks today, namely whether religion makes people better or worse. A few years ago, Joanna Adams, who was the pastor of a prominent Chicago congregation, gave an amazing sermon on the subject of religions and conflict. She spoke these words to the congregation. I quote, "Here is an irony of the first order. At a time when religion and its leaders ought to be showing the world the way to common good, ought to be building communities that are hospitable to life, ought to be about enhancing civility and tolerance, exactly the opposite is happening in many quarters of the world. We read every day in the newspapers about the destruction that religion and self-righteousness are doing." And she concluded, not long after September 11, someone scribbled these chilling words on the wall of a building in Washington, D.C. Quote, "Dear God, please save us from the people who believe in you." Reverend Adams posed a question that should be uppermost in the minds of all people of faith, and that is, does religion help or hurt the human family? Can't religion enable people to defeat these forces that so often bring out the worst in human nature rather than encouraging these sinister forces? Everywhere we look, we find fanatics and religious zealots who have gained the upper hand. In our daily newspapers, they are filled with horror stories of unspeakable violence that people inflict upon one another, presumably in the name of religion. And in fact, yes, the majority of conflicts in the world today are the result of religious strife. And this is nothing new. It has been that way through most of recorded history. One need not be an atheist to wonder whether religion itself might actually be the problem. Why does religion seem continuously to bring out the worst rather than the best in people? Why are so many acts of brutality committed in the name of religion? What is there about religion that causes some people to feel so sure of their own position that they are willing to inflict violence and even death upon those who disagree with them? I don't pretend to have the answers to these very difficult questions, but it's obvious that religious zealotry has been the cause, or I think I would rather say the pretext, more accurately, for many of the worst acts of the human race. And this is what some people have been doing, falsely, I would say, in the name of religion since time immemorial. It's all terribly tragic, isn't it? But shaking our heads in resignation doesn't accomplish very much at all. Nor does our raging against the excesses of religious fanaticism do anything whatsoever to change the course of events. We may derive some satisfaction from knowing that we, at least, are not like those fanatics, that our religious ideals and values are much more civilized than theirs. But having patted ourselves on the back for our enlightened attitudes, what comes next? The onus is upon all of us who profess our belief in religious liberalism to do more than to cast blame on those who are extreme. And I would say, yes, that most of us are failing the test. We do a lot of hand-wringing, but when it comes to action, I'm sorry to say that we mostly come up far short. Mostly what we do is pass resolutions and send or withhold financial support, and maybe even sing "Give Peace a Chance," which you sang very enthusiastically. But that's about all we do. That's about it. We don't really put ourselves on the line as I believe we ought to. The sin of religious liberals is that we don't seem to care as much as the zealots. Few of us are willing to inconvenience ourselves very much in support of our conscience or our convictions. Let me turn our attention to one specific situation that is desperately urgent right now and in our own times. A humanitarian crisis of immense proportions is gripping the people of Syria. Tens of thousands of innocent people have already died, and hundreds of thousands, even millions, are being displaced from their homes by the Syrian civil war, and there is no end in sight. Nearly half of the population of Syria are now refugees, hoping to find some place where they can be secure in other countries in the West, including the United States. Now, I'm not here to make this address a criticism of the immigration restrictions upon Muslims that are being proposed by the President. All I wish to say is that as people of conscience, we dare not turn our backs on those who have become refugees. If we are to be true to our calling, we need to find ways of offering tangible assistance to those refugees. And this is what our churches and synagogues around the country did quite a few years ago when thousands of boat people from Vietnam, fleeing the North Vietnamese, sought refuge following the collapse of the south of Vietnam. I remember it well, and perhaps you do too, that congregations of all kinds, Jewish, Christian, Universalists, Unitarians, the works, we all stepped up and we adopted the Vietnamese families, and we helped them to build new lives for themselves in America, which they have very successfully, I'm proud to say. In fact, I will always feel good about what my own congregation of the time did to help specific refugee families. Instead of waiting patiently as the diplomats continue to fumble and debate and point fingers over who is to blame, and while this civil war goes on and on, thousands continue to stream out in utter desperation. The pursuit of a more just and peaceful world requires of us, of liberal persuasion, an intensity of commitment that is equal to the zealotry that we all hate and despise. And yet somehow I sense that most religious liberals, ourselves included, regard supportive causes primarily as a vicarious activity. By that I mean, yes, we read articles in the New York Times or we watch CNN and we nod our heads in utter desperation, but in resignation. And that's about where it begins and where it ends. Essentially, the moderate forces of religion have been far too quiet and far too acquiescent. We need to practice more what we preach so beautifully in sanctuaries such as this. As we watch and disgust at the fanatics of the world who wreak havoc on our world, inflicting unspeakable harm on individual innocent children, women, and men, supposedly, yes, supposedly, in the name of their religion, we have to do much more than express moral outrage and pass resolutions or send polite donations to this or that relief organization. We have to begin with ourselves, rolling up our own sleeves and doing something about it, because there are people that are coming to this and other countries who have lost everything, who have come out of Syria in fear and desperation, and they need human assistance. So we must rise to the challenge, and it is time for us to join forces with others who share our hopes and our sadness. We may not succeed in bringing peace to the Middle East or anywhere else, but we can help to save individual lives, not just by grand gestures or resolutions, but by individual acts of compassion, of love, and concern. Let us not fail for our lack of determination or the faith that we can make a difference. Perhaps not in the macrocosm, in the larger world, but certainly in the microcosm of individual lives and little churches and synagogues such as our own. We should never underestimate the considerable power that religious communities possess when we are willing to work together and just do something. The course of individual lives has been altered many times through the positive power of religion on the most personal of levels. We do our respective religions a grave disservice when we minimize the potential impact of faith to motivate perhaps not entire worlds or societies or countries, but to motivate individuals, families, and religious communities just to do something to be of help. These are the purposes for which I believe religion really exists, namely to make a difference in our world through individual lives to alleviate suffering and to be personal instruments of peace and compassion. We have a word in Judaism. The word is mitzvah, which means religious obligation. It means much more than a good deed. And there is a saying in our tradition that there is no such thing as a trivial or a wasted religious mitzvah. No matter how small, no matter how fleeting, if it's something that comes from the heart, it is destined and guaranteed to enter the heart of another person. And this is what we call tikkun olam, repairing our world, not in the grandiose sense, but person by person, heart to heart, hand to hand. That's what it means to perform a mitzvah. And so I would say this to us all, that we are not here in this congregation just to sing hymns and offer prayers and wish well to one another, although that's all important. We are here to bring inspiration to ourselves so that we may bring healing and hope to the troubled people who are suffering so much day after day. I do not underestimate the power of conscience, and we should not underestimate the power of our faith to inspire acts of loving kindness among each and every one of us. For Jews, on our high holy days, which you may know something about, included among our prayers are the confession of transgressions, one of which is the sin of omission, another of which is the sin of silence. In the defining documents of the Unitarian Universal movement are these words: we believe that people are punished by their sins, not for them. We also believe that we are enriched by our virtues and that the good we do lives with us and helps make the world better. I am told that you could attend a Unitarian Universalist church for years and almost never hear the word sin. I understand this, and in some ways I respect it, but we also need to acknowledge that, yes, sins are real, and we do ourselves no service by denying that they are real. When people of faith point their fingers at religious fanatics, but fail to accept personal responsibility themselves, I am willing to say that is a sin. But as we should all be aware, making amends, or as we Jews call it, making atonement, does not just mean saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Real atonement includes a change of both attitude and behavior, the acknowledgement of past failure or silence, and the sincere intent to do things differently from here on. The ancient words of the prophet Isaiah continue to resonate in the hearts of all people of faith, or at least they should, and I quote briefly: "Is this not the fast that I have chosen, to unlock the shackles of injustice, to undo the fetters of bondage, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every cruel chain? And if you remove the chains of oppression, the menacing hand, if you make sacrifices for the hungry and the weak and the homeless, and bring relief to those who are afflicted, then your light shall shine in the darkness, and your night will become bright as the noonday sun." And the words of that prophet should be our marching orders in this time of great challenge. demonstrating to one and all that religion can and will and must be a force for good in our world, not through the grandiose, but through individual lives, individual families, individual congregations such as this. Each of us is called by our faith to be among those who are committed to bringing some light into the darkened lives of others, and to be among those who will always be those who are willing to offer a helping hand. And I'd like to think that one day soon, perhaps even on a wall in a town or a city like Bradenton, where former refugees may have become residents and perhaps even citizens, that someone will feel compelled to write in bold letters on a wall of this city, "Dear God, thank you for all those people who believe in you." Thanks very much. Good morning.